On a quiet, foggy evening in a forgotten town, there was a story that no one dared to speak about. It was a tale about a boy, abandoned by the world, forced to survive in the most unimaginable of places. A graveyard. Alone, hungry and desperate, he resorted to eating whatever scraps he could find, even if it meant living off dog food. But no one could have predicted what would happen next, what he would discover hidden beneath the gravestones, or the horrors that would follow. This is a story that will send chills down your spine and make you question everything you thought you knew about survival. Stay tuned. What happens next will leave you speechless. Part 1. The Abandoned Child. The town was small, tucked away between the hills, with only a few roads winding through it. People who lived there had all but forgotten the cemetery that sat on the outskirts of town. It was an old place, with overgrown weeds and crumbling headstones that seemed to whisper forgotten names in the wind. But for one boy, that cemetery wasn't a place to mourn. It was his home. His name was Thomas. Barely 12 years old, with shaggy hair and dirt-streaked clothes, he had no family. No one knew how he ended up there. Some said he ran away. Others whispered darker things. Things that made people look over their shoulders at night. But no one knew the full story. They only knew that he lived among the dead, sleeping in the cold earth beneath a stone, with only the sound of wind and the occasional animal to keep him company. Thomas didn't have much, but he did have his dog, Max. A scrappy mutt with matted fur and eyes full of loyalty. Max had been his only friend for as long as Thomas could remember. Together, they scavenged for food, finding scraps where they could. It wasn't much, but it kept them alive. The dog was always by his side, offering comfort in the form of his presence. One day, as the sun began to dip behind the hills, Thomas walked down the overgrown path between the graves, looking for something to eat. He knew that his survival depended on resourcefulness. The local market had long since stopped offering food to him. No one wanted to help the boy who lived in the graveyard, especially not after the rumors began. Max trotted along beside him, sniffing the ground. They had found a can of beans earlier that day, but it wasn't enough to fill the hunger gnawing at Thomas's stomach. The dog suddenly stopped and sniffed at a small pile near one of the old tombstones. Thomas walked over, curious. It was a bag of dog food, discarded and half opened. At first, Thomas hesitated. It wasn't what he wanted, but it was food. And food was food, no matter where it came from. Without thinking much more about it, he sat down, tearing open the bag, and scooped some of the dry kibble into his hands. Max barked excitedly, wagging his tail, and Thomas smiled for the first time that day as he tossed a few pieces to his dog. It was grim, but they made do with what they had. And that's how Thomas's life went. One day bled into the next, each one indistinguishable from the last. Days spent searching for scraps, nights spent under the cold, starry sky, accompanied by the occasional sound of distant thunder or the hoot of an owl. But something was different now. That evening, as the wind whispered through the branches of the trees, Thomas felt a chill on the back of his neck. Something in the air had shifted. Max had stopped eating, his eyes trained on something beyond the tombstones. His ears perked up. Thomas glanced around nervously, a sense of unease crawling up his spine. There was nothing, only the graves, the wind, and the faint echo of distant footsteps. Footsteps that weren't his own. Part 2. The First Encounter. The wind howled through the trees, casting eerie shadows across the cemetery. Thomas stood up, wiping his hands on his pants, his senses on high alert. Max growled softly, his gaze fixed on something in the distance. Thomas had never felt fear like this before. In the past, he had always felt alone, but never truly alone. There had always been something in the cemetery, an unseen presence that was comforting in its way. It felt like the earth itself was watching over him. But now, something was wrong. There was a presence that wasn't comforting, something dark, something that didn't belong. He grabbed Max's collar, pulling him closer as they slowly moved toward the sound of the footsteps. But the further they walked, the more disoriented Thomas became. The sounds of the wind faded, and all he could hear was the sound of his own heart pounding in his chest. As they neared the center of the cemetery, Thomas saw something that made his blood run cold. In the clearing ahead of him, standing tall and ominous, was a figure, At first, he thought it was just a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the moon. But then, the figure moved, slowly, deliberately. It stepped toward him. It was tall, cloaked in black, with a hood that obscured its face. Thomas's breath caught in his throat. Max barked furiously, tugging at Thomas's hand. But Thomas stood frozen, unable to move. The figure stopped just before him, and Thomas could feel the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. It wasn't just the figure. It was the presence, a sense of something ancient, something evil, and yet something familiar. It felt as though it had been waiting for him. The figure raised one hand and pointed toward the far end of the cemetery. Thomas's voice cracked as he managed to whisper, What do you want?" The figure didn't answer, but Thomas felt the pressure of its presence grow stronger. Then, as if in answer, the figure lowered its arm and turned toward the distant tombstones. Slowly, it began to walk away, vanishing between the overgrown graves as though it had never been there at all. Max stopped barking, his tail between his legs. He looked up at Thomas, and for a moment, Thomas thought he saw something like fear in his dog's eyes. The boy swallowed hard and took a tentative step forward, his eyes scanning the cemetery. But when he reached the place where the figure had stood, he saw something that made his stomach turn. There, lying on the ground, was a single old-fashioned key. Part 3. The Hidden Door. The key was cold to the touch, its edges worn from age. Thomas examined it closely, feeling a strange compulsion to keep it. Something deep inside him told him that it was important, something he had to find. But what could it open? The cemetery had been abandoned for as long as Thomas could remember. There were no doors, no gates, just graves, tombstones, and the occasional crypt, most of them long forgotten. Max seemed hesitant, as if urging Thomas to turn back. But the boy was determined. He clutched the key tightly, his mind racing with possibilities. What had the figure wanted him to find? What was hidden here? Without another word, he set off in the direction the figure had pointed. He knew the cemetery better than anyone. He had spent years wandering, its rows of graves, memorizing every crack in the stone, every weathered inscription. And yet, today, everything felt different. Every step felt like it was leading him closer to something terrible. At the farthest corner of the cemetery, hidden behind a wall of thick vines and ivy, Thomas found what he was looking for. It was a door, hidden beneath layers of moss and decay, so well concealed that it might have been overlooked by anyone else. But Thomas had seen it before, in his dreams, a door that whispered his name in the dead of night. He knelt down and inserted the key into the rusted lock. To his surprise, it turned with ease, as if the door had been waiting for him all along. Max barked nervously, but Thomas pushed the door open. Behind it was a small, dimly lit room, the walls covered in dust and cobwebs. In the center of the room stood an old stone pedestal, and on top of it, something that made Thomas's heart skip a beat. It was a small, ancient box. Part 4. The Dark Secret. Thomas reached out, his fingers trembling as he lifted the box from the pedestal. It was cold, much colder than anything should have been. And as soon as his hands touched it, a flood of memories surged through his mind. Memories that weren't his. The cemetery, the figure, the whispers, and the boy who had been here before. The boy who had lived here before him. His thoughts swirled as he opened the box, revealing what lay inside. A small, delicate necklace. Its charm was a dark stone, shaped like a skull. As soon as Thomas touched it, the air in the room seemed to grow heavier, thicker, and a strange sensation washed over him. Suddenly, a voice echoed in his mind. "It's your turn now." The darkness seemed to swallow the room whole, and Thomas felt the weight of centuries pressing down on him. Part 5. The Unbreakable Cycle. The voice in his head faded, but the feeling remained. Max growled, his fur standing on end. But Thomas didn't move. He couldn't. His mind was trapped in the flood of images, the overwhelming sense of dread that had consumed him. And then, as if answering an unspoken question, the shadows shifted. From the corner of his eye, Thomas saw the figure again. The cloaked figure who had led him here. This time, however, it wasn't just standing there. It was smiling, but there was no warmth in that smile, only emptiness. The figure's voice echoed through Thomas's mind once more. It's your turn now. You will take my place." The darkness closed in, and everything around him began to fade. The boy who had once lived in the cemetery, the one who had scavenged for scraps, was no more. And now, it was Thomas's turn. Conclusion. The cemetery stood silent once again, the wind whispering through the gravestones. But now, there was another shadow among the stones, and the cycle began again.